When I first met my wife, I was just a truck driver. I was making decent money, enough to live comfortably, but it was nothing extravagant, somewhere between $50,000 and $70,000 a year, depending on how good the year was. I enjoyed the work well enough, but I always had this nagging feeling in the back of my head that I could be doing something more. Something better. My wife, girlfriend at the time, grew up in a completely different world than I did. She was raised in a financially unstable household. Her grandfather had money, but her mother and sister never seemed to. Money was always tight for them, and they learned to scrape by, to stretch every dollar until it begged for mercy. As a result, my wife developed an incredibly strong work ethic, some might call it obsessive. She worked herself to the bone, never missing a shift, never making excuses. She took pride in it, and honestly, it was one of the things that first drew me to her. When I eventually got into a niche specialty in marketing, everything changed. I had a talent for it, and my friends, many of whom were also in the business, encouraged me to start my own company. The idea terrified me. I had always relied on the stability of a paycheck, and taking the leap into self-employment felt like stepping off a cliff without knowing if there was a parachute strapped to my back. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I had to at least try. I talked it over with my wife, and she was completely supportive. We had an honest discussion about what it would mean for us financially. I made sure she understood that some months, I might not be able to pay myself at all. I would still drive trucks part-time to have some sort of reliable income, but I would be making significantly less for a while. She didn't care. She told me that if this was something I was passionate about, she was behind me 100%. That's the kind of woman she is. Her family, however, was a completely different story. The moment they caught wind of my plan, the judgment started pouring in. They made it painfully clear that they thought I was making a massive mistake. They called me lazy, accused me of trying to leech off my wife, and said I was neglecting my responsibilities as a man. They could not wrap their heads around the fact that working from home was still working. To them, if I wasn't out breaking my back for someone else's company, then I wasn't really working. It didn't matter how many times my wife defended me or tried to explain what I was doing, they just ignored her and kept up their nonsense. Things really came to a head when they found out we were still sending our daughter to daycare even though I was working from home. That just sent them over the edge. According to them, I was a deadbeat, a bad father, and completely useless. They saw no reason why I couldn't be watching my daughter while simultaneously running a business from scratch. As if juggling a toddler and trying to establish a company was a realistic expectation. It was exhausting. But I kept my head down, focused on my work, and tuned them out as best as I could. And then something amazing happened. I started making real money. At first, it was just enough to match what I was making as a truck driver, but then it surpassed that. Before I knew it, I was pulling in more money than I had ever seen in my life, and my business had barely any overhead costs. Since we had spent the first year living frugally and cutting out unnecessary expenses, we never really went back to our old spending habits. That meant we suddenly had all this extra money, and we weren't blowing it on pointless things. And wouldn't you know it? That's when her family suddenly started changing their tune. All of a sudden, they wanted to spend time with us. They wanted to go out to eat, go on trips, have fun, except, in their minds, having fun apparently meant me paying for everything. They seemed to believe that since I had more money now, I was obligated to cover their expenses whenever we went out. And when I didn't, they got mad. I always paid my part of the bill, and obviously, I took care of anything that involved my wife or our daughter. But I was not about to start paying for grown adults who had spent the last year running their mouths about how I was a deadbeat. I saw through them immediately. These were the same people who had mocked me, insulted me, and written me off as a failure. But now that there was money involved, they had conveniently forgotten all of that. My wife, to her credit, never tried to pressure me into giving them money. She spends her own money how she wants, and sometimes that includes helping her family out. That's fine. I respect that. But I made it very clear that I did not want a single cent of my money going to them. Not after the way they treated me. Looking back, it all makes sense. Her family was always bad with money. They spent beyond their means, lived paycheck to paycheck, and never planned for the future. And yet, somehow, they still felt entitled to mine. I love my wife. I support her in everything she does. But I will never forget the way her family treated me when I was struggling to build something for myself. And I sure as hell will never reward them for it. Update 1. I never expected things to go smoothly with my wife's family. I knew that once they realized I was making good money, their attitudes toward me would shift, but I was not prepared for just how entitled they would become. At first, it was subtle. It started with little things, suggestions, passive-aggressive comments, and the occasional joke about how, since I was making more now, I should be treating the family more often. When we went out to eat, they would conveniently forget their wallets or act surprised when the bill came, waiting just long enough to see if I would offer to cover it. But I never did. I paid for my wife, I paid for myself, and if they weren't quick enough, sometimes I even covered my wife's sister just to keep the peace. But beyond that, I refused to budge. Then, the direct requests started rolling in. My wife's mother needed help with a car payment. Her sister needed rent money because she had overspent and was short this month. They always had a reason, always an excuse. And when I refused, they didn't take it well. They acted like I was betraying them. Like I owed them something. It didn't matter that I had built this business from nothing, that I had struggled, that they had mocked me for taking the risk in the first place. Now that there was money, they felt entitled to it. At one point, my wife's sister called me outright selfish for refusing to lend her money when I clearly had more than enough. The audacity was astonishing. This was the same person who had called me lazy, who had looked down on me when I was struggling. And now she wanted a handout? I stayed firm. I refused her, and she didn't talk to me for weeks. Honestly, I enjoyed the silence. But it didn't end there. It escalated. My wife's mother came to us with an urgent request, her rent was overdue, and she was on the verge of eviction. Now, here's the thing. I don't want to see anyone lose their home. But I also knew for a fact that she had been spending money on unnecessary things. I had seen her post on social media about going on little weekend trips, eating out, buying expensive new clothes, things that didn't align with someone who was about to be evicted. It was classic financial irresponsibility. She spun the story in a way that made it sound like it was life or death, like she had no way out and just needed a little help this one time. But I wasn't stupid. I knew that if I helped her once, it would never be a one-time thing. It would be the start of an expectation that I would always be there to bail her out whenever she mismanaged her money. So, I said no. She was furious. I had never seen her so angry. She called me ungrateful, told me I didn't deserve my success, and even said that if it weren't for my wife, I would still be just a truck driver. That one stung. Not because I was ashamed of my past job, I had worked hard for my money then, just like I worked hard for it now, but because it showed just how little she respected me. But despite all this, I kept pushing forward. My business continued to grow. I was making more money than ever, and it was becoming obvious that I had out-earned anything I had ever made in trucking. And here's where things started to get even weirder. Out of nowhere, my wife's family started treating me like some kind of golden ticket. It was like they had rewritten history in their own heads. They went from resenting me to trying to claim me as their own success story. Suddenly, my wife's mother was bragging about how she had always believed in me, how she had always known I was smart enough to make it. Her sister, who had spent months avoiding me after I refused her money, suddenly wanted to talk again. She wanted to reconnect, to spend more time together. But I knew better. They didn't want to be part of my life. They wanted access to my money. And then came the plot twist I never saw coming. One day, my wife sat me down and told me something I never expected. Her grandfather, the only one in her family who had money, had reached out to her. He wanted to meet with me. I didn't know what to expect. From what I had heard, he was always distant from the rest of the family. He had money, but he never handed it out freely, and he didn't seem to respect the way his daughter and granddaughter handled their finances. He had apparently watched from a distance as I built my business, and now, for some reason, he wanted to talk to me. So, I met with him. And what he told me shocked me. He told me that he had been watching everything unfold. He had seen the way my wife's mother and sister treated me when I was struggling. He had seen how they flipped the moment they realized I was successful. And, apparently, he had seen something in me that he respected. Then, he dropped the bombshell. He wanted me to take over managing some of his investments. At first, I thought I had misheard him. But no, he was serious. He had seen how I handled my own money, how I built something from nothing, and he trusted me more than his own family to oversee some of his finances. He didn't want his wealth to fall into the hands of people who would squander it. I didn't know how to respond. This was the same man who had kept his distance from his own daughter and granddaughter, and now he was entrusting me with something huge. I told him I would think about it. And that's where things stand now. On one hand, it feels like validation. After all the disrespect, all the judgment, the one person in my wife's family who actually built something for himself sees my value. But on the other hand, I know this is going to make things even worse with the rest of her family. If they find out, they'll see it as an even bigger betrayal. I never wanted to be caught up in their family's drama. I just wanted to build something for myself and my wife. But now, I have a decision to make, one that could change everything. Update 2. After much consideration, I agreed to my wife's grandfather's offer. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this was an opportunity one couldn't ignore. This man had built and maintained his wealth, watched his own family fumble with money, and yet, out of everyone, he chose me. That had to mean something. It was validation that I was doing something right. It was proof that my success wasn't a fluke, it was built on the foundation of hard work, discipline, and smart decisions. But I wasn't naive. I knew accepting this deal would cause another explosion with my wife's family. So, I made a calculated decision. I told her grandfather that I would take a month to prove myself. I would manage some of his assets, send him returns, and if he was satisfied, we would continue. It felt like the right call. I wasn't committing blindly, and it gave me a chance to show him that I was serious. What I didn't expect was how quickly word would spread. Somehow, whether from my wife's sister, her mother, or some other loose-lipped relative, her family found out. And just like that, everything blew up again. This time, the accusations weren't just about me being selfish. They escalated. They called me a traitor. They claimed I was manipulating their grandfather, taking advantage of an old man, and turning him against his own family. They had completely flipped their stance. Before, I was nothing, a useless man who got lucky. Now, I was suddenly an evil mastermind, pulling strings, and scheming against them. The sheer hypocrisy was mind-blowing. These were the same people who had never shown an ounce of respect for him when he was alive and well, yet now that there was money involved, they suddenly cared about his well-being? It was absurd. My wife tried to talk sense into them, but it was pointless. They had made up their minds. Their rage wasn't actually about her grandfather, it was about control. They had no control over him, and they had no control over me, and that made them furious. The tension in the family became unbearable. My wife and I couldn't even have a normal conversation with them anymore, without it turning into a fight. It was exhausting, and we both realized we needed a break. So, we made a decision. We booked a vacation. It was something we had talked about for a while. We had the money now, and we both deserved some time away from the chaos. Somewhere warm, somewhere peaceful, somewhere far away from her family's nonsense. And then, just as we were finalizing our plans, her family dropped the next bombshell. They wanted to come with us. At first, it was framed as a joke. Then, it wasn't. They outright told us that they wanted to go on vacation with us, the very same people who had spent months calling me a manipulative, greedy, selfish monster. The kicker? They didn't have the money for it. But, don't worry, they had a solution. They wanted me to pay for them up front, and they would pay me back later. It was almost impressive how shameless they were. We sat down to process it. I asked my wife what she thought, and to my absolute relief, she didn't hesitate. She told me they didn't deserve it. She said that this was our money, built from our sacrifices, and there was absolutely no reason to fund a vacation for people who only seemed to care about us when it benefited them. For the first time in this entire situation, I felt a massive weight lift off my shoulders. I didn't have to be the bad guy. I didn't have to argue, I didn't have to justify myself, I didn't have to go through another cycle of guilt-tripping and manipulation. My wife shut it down, and that was that. We left for vacation, just the two of us, and for the first time in months, we were completely free of her family's drama. No phone calls, no guilt trips, no financial obligations. Just us, living the life we had worked so hard to build. But of course, the story doesn't end there. When we got back, we were met with silence from her family. Not just the passive-aggressive kind. Total silence. No calls, no texts, no comments on social media. At first, it was a relief. But then, something felt off. I started to wonder, had they finally given up, or were they plotting something? It turns out, it was the latter. Not long after we returned, my wife's sister made a public post on social media about how family should come first, how it was disgusting to see people prioritize wealth over relationships, and how she hoped that certain people enjoyed their money while they could because one day, they would have no one left. It was a clear shot at us. A final attempt to guilt us back into their web. But this time, we didn't take the bait. For the first time in my life, I felt completely free of their influence. And then, as if the universe had one last plot twist in store, my wife's grandfather officially signed over a portion of his investments for me to manage. It was done. The very man they claimed I was manipulating had just solidified my role in handling his wealth. And her family? They had burned every bridge they had. And now, for the first time in a long, long time, they were truly on their own. Update 3. By this point, I had made peace with the fact that my wife's family would never truly accept me. Not in the way they should. Not in the way that mattered. I had spent years proving myself, pulling us from financial instability into success, yet no matter what I did, it was never enough for them. But I had one thing they didn't, my wife's unwavering support and the validation of the one man in their family who actually understood what it took to build something for yourself. Her grandfather. He was completely on our side. I kept my word to him. Every month, I sent him generous returns from his investments, more than he even expected. At first, he was hesitant, he even told me that it was too much, that he didn't need me to send him so much. But I stood my ground. This was his money. He had believed in me, invested in me when no one else had, and it was only right that he saw the rewards of that trust. And you know what? He was pleased. More than pleased. For the first time, he saw firsthand what happened when someone handled money correctly. I had doubled, even tripled, some of his investments. He wasn't just getting his money back, he was making more than he had in years. The old man was thriving, and I could tell he was enjoying the irony of it all. The very family members who had ignored him unless they needed something were now cut off, while the man they had dismissed and insulted was the one securing his financial future. I was pleased, too. Not just because of the money, but because it felt like justice. And yet, despite all of this, despite everything I had done, my wife's family still wasn't satisfied. I made one last attempt to extend an olive branch. On their birthdays, I gave generous gifts. Expensive ones. Thoughtful ones. Things that, in any normal family, would be met with gratitude. I thought, for a brief moment, that maybe, just maybe, this would make things easier. That maybe, now that time had passed and they had seen that I wasn't some manipulative villain, they would soften a little. But I was wrong. They weren't grateful. They were entitled. They picked apart my gifts, criticized them, compared them to what I could have given. I overheard them talking, whispering about how, with the kind of money I had, I could have gone bigger. That I was still being stingy. That if I really cared, I would have gone all out. That was the moment it truly clicked for me. It didn't matter what I did. It didn't matter how much I gave. It didn't matter how much I tried. It would never be enough for them. These people held a grudge against me simply because I didn't hand them my entire bank account. That was the real problem. It was never about them wanting me to be a good husband, a good provider, a good man. It was about access. They wanted access to my wealth, and since I refused to give it to them, they would always find a reason to be resentful. And that's when I made my final decision. I was done. No more gifts. No more olive branches. No more attempts at making things right. They didn't deserve it. They never would. So, I stepped back. Completely. I let them stew in their bitterness while I thrived. And let me tell you, I thrived. My business continued to grow, my investments flourished, and most importantly, my marriage remained strong. My wife was happy. She saw what I saw. She knew what her family had become, and she never once pressured me to bend to them. In fact, she was relieved when I finally put my foot down. Because at the end of the day, our life was good. We had everything we needed. Stability, love, and a future that we built together. And that brings me to the final question. Am I an asshole? Honestly? No. I don't think I am. I did everything a man is supposed to do. I worked hard. I provided. I protected my wife from financial instability. I secured our future. And I genuinely tried, to be good to her family, even when they didn't deserve it. But the reality is, some people can't be pleased. Some people see generosity as weakness, as an invitation to take more. Some people will never be satisfied, because their greed will always outgrow their gratitude. So no, I don't regret a thing. I succeeded. I built a life for my family, I earned the respect of the one family member who actually mattered, and most importantly, I never compromised my dignity in the process. And now, I can move forward without looking back. Am I the asshole? Absolutely not. If anything, the way things unfolded has only confirmed that I did exactly what I needed to do. Because here's the thing, nothing has changed. Even after all the chaos, even after every entitled demand, every manipulation attempt, every insult, my wife's family still acts the same. They still believe that I owe them something. They still think that because I am financially successful, I am obligated to fund their lifestyles. They still talk behind my back, whisper about how I could do more for them, still throw tantrums when I refuse to hand them free money, like I'm some walking ATM. Meanwhile, my wife's grandfather? That man is thriving. He has everything he needs, and more. He doesn't have to worry about financial instability, doesn't have to deal with the leeches that are his daughter and granddaughter. He sees his bank account growing, his investments flourishing, and he's enjoying his damn life. The difference between him and the rest of my wife's family is staggering. He respected money. He respected me. And in return, I respected him. And look at where that got us. He has security. His daughter and granddaughter have nothing but resentment. Because here's the reality, money doesn't change people, it reveals them. When I was struggling to get my business off the ground, my wife's family showed their true colors. They mocked me. Called me lazy. Dismissed my efforts. They had no faith in me, no belief in my vision. They didn't stand by me when I was building something from the ground up. But the moment I became successful, suddenly, I was supposed to be their provider. They hated the idea of me succeeding on my own terms. It ate them alive that I had built something without their input, without their control, without their approval. And once I started making real money, they saw me as a resource, not as family. They didn't respect me. They didn't even like me. They only saw what I could do for them. And when I refused? When I set boundaries and held my ground? They turned on me again.